The safe had been sitting in lot 47 since 7 that morning, and by the time the crowd got to it, nobody was pretending to be interested. It was a Mosler floor model, the old kind, maybe a 1940s or early 1950s unit, the type they used to bolt into the concrete in small-town banks and insurance offices before everything went digital and the thinking changed. It stood about 32 inches tall and weighed, somebody guessed, somewhere north of 350 pounds. The black paint had gone rust orange in long vertical streaks down the front, and the dial was frozen at 11. Either that, or it had always pointed to 11, which was the kind of thing nobody bothered to find out. The handle was seized. The door hadn't opened in what looked like decades. Every man in that auction barn in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, looked at that safe and saw the same thing. Scrap weight. A problem that would cost more to solve than it was worth. One man from outside Rennick, a retired appliance repair fellow named Dale Hicks, who told this story later to anyone who would listen, said he walked up close, tapped the side of it with 2 knuckles, and figured the inside was probably as rusted as the outside. He said the Mosler dial was so corroded it felt like tapping a gravestone. He walked away. There was one person in that auction barn who didn't walk away. And she was not a man. She was 17 years old. Her name was Mara Spence. She had come to the Greenbrier County Farm and Estate auction on the 3rd Saturday of April, 2019, with her older brother Calvin, who was 22, and had driven his Ford F-250 4 hours from Charleston specifically to look at a set of used John Deere 6 Series components being sold from the Alderman estate. Mara was there because their mother had asked Calvin not to leave her home alone on a Saturday, which Calvin resented quietly, and Mara didn't seem to care about either way. She wasn't there for any particular purpose. She wasn't there looking for anything. She found something anyway. Somebody had to write this one down, or it would have been forgotten. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, take a second to subscribe before we go any further. The rest of it matters. The sale that morning had drawn maybe 200 people through the doors of the Alderman Auction Hall on Route 219, which sat about 11 miles south of Lewisburg and hosted 4 or 5 large estate sales a year, in addition to the regular cattle and equipment days. It was not a famous barn. The Greenbrier County crowd who came to it were not famous people. They were the kind of people who drive pickup trucks with salt stains on the wheel wells and keep a spiral notebook in the center console for writing down what things sold for. Because that's how you learn what things are worth. They came early. They walked the rows before bidding started. They formed opinions about what was worth chasing and what wasn't. And those opinions hardened fast, the way opinions do in a crowd of people who have bought things at auction before and learned their lessons. The air inside the barn that morning had that particular April smell, damp concrete and old wood. Something faintly of machine oil from the equipment lined up along the north wall, and the low undertone of diesel from a generator running somewhere outside. It was cold enough that people kept their coats on. Bidding hadn't started yet. The folding chairs in the center of the barn were about half full, and people moved through the lots with their arms crossed and their eyes moving sideways, the way buyers do when they don't want anyone to know what they're looking at. The Mosler safe was not worth chasing. That opinion formed fast and didn't require much discussion. The auction catalog had listed it as vintage floor safe, as is, no combination, non-operational. The estate attorney had told Darn Coots, who was running the sale that day with 31 years of doing it behind him, that the family had no record of the combination and no memory of anyone opening it since the 1980s. Could have nothing in it. Probably did have nothing in it. A locksmith who had looked at it the week before gave a quote of $440 just to get the door open, which was more than the safe was likely to bring its sale. Coots had slotted it into the back of the catalog for a reason. Mara Spence spent about 12 minutes with that safe. Nobody else was paying attention to her, which was why Dale Hicks, standing about 15 feet off looking at a lot of old hand tools, was one of the few people who noticed her at all. He said later he thought she was just a teenager killing time, the way teenagers do. She didn't look like she was killing time. She crouched in front of the safe and studied the dial housing first. She ran a finger along the edge of the bezel, where the metal meets the dial face, tracing the seam slowly. Then she stood and walked around to the left side of the unit, crouched again, and pressed her palm flat against the body panel below the hinge line. Not the door, the side. She held it there for maybe 4 seconds. Then she moved her hand up about 6 inches and pressed again. Dale Hicks said he noticed she was doing it the same way both times, with her palm flat and her wrist slightly cocked, like she was listening with her hand. Then she put her ear to the body of the safe, the way you might press your ear to an old wall you thought might be hollow. He said he didn't know why she did any of that. He just noticed she did. She pulled a small black notebook out of her jacket pocket, not a phone, a notebook, and wrote something in it. 3 or 4 lines. She looked at the safe once more, checked something on the lower edge of the back seam, then tucked the notebook away and went to find her brother. The whole thing took 12 minutes by Dale's count, because he had checked his phone when she started and checked it again when she left. He wasn't sure why he did that. It just seemed like the kind of thing worth noting. What Mara Spence knew about safes, she had learned from her grandfather, Roy Spence, who had died 14 months before that April auction. Roy had worked for 37 years as a vault and safe technician, mostly under contract with small savings banks and credit unions across central West Virginia, the kind of institutions that still had 1940s-era Moslers and Halls and Diebold's bolted into their floors because replacing them was expensive, and the old ones still worked. He had traveled with a small set of tools in a foam-lined Pelican case and a notebook where he wrote down serial number ranges, production year estimates, and the known failure points for each model he'd worked on. Roy was not a man who talked much. His daughter, Mara's mother, said he could go 2 full days without saying anything that wasn't directly required. It wasn't unfriendliness. It was just how he was put together. He had grown up in Nicholas County, in a household where quiet was the default, and he had never found a reason to change. When he worked with a kind of absolute patience that most people found either impressive or maddening, depending on how much they needed the job done fast. He did not rush safes. He said once that a safe was an old machine, that it held something someone thought was worth protecting, and it deserved to be treated accordingly. He had 3 grandchildren. 2 of them weren't particularly interested in his notebooks. Mara was. She had started reading them at 13, sitting cross-legged on the floor of Roy's workshop behind the house in Somersville, while he worked at his bench and didn't particularly acknowledge her being there. She asked him a question once about a notation she didn't understand, something about a locking bolt geometry on a Hall safe model from the late 1930s, and Roy had looked up from what he was doing, considered her for a moment, and then explained it in the careful way he explained things, which was with total seriousness and no condescension. She had more questions the next visit. He answered them the same way. By the time she was 15, she had gone with him on 3 service calls. He didn't explain what he was doing while he did it. He just let her watch. If she asked something, he answered. If she didn't ask, he didn't volunteer. Roy had a phrase he used when he was teaching her, The one or two times he said anything that sounded like a lesson out loud. He said, "A good safe tells you most of what it knows if you know how to ask." He meant that the exterior of a unit, the corrosion pattern, the body seams, the dial type, the handle mechanism, the paint wear on the edges, contained information about the interior, the manufacturer, the production era, and the use history. The safe had a story. Most people didn't speak the language. Roy died in February of 2018, 6 weeks after they told him about the cancer in his liver. He left his tools to a man he'd worked alongside for 20 years. He left his 7 notebooks to Mara. He didn't say anything particular when he did it. It was in the will, not in a conversation. But she understood what the choice meant. She had brought 2 of the notebooks to the auction. The one she'd opened in front of the safe was the one Roy had dedicated to Mosler models, with production year estimates organized by serial number range and known interior configurations written in his small, right, tilted handwriting. What Mara had been doing in front of that safe, the palm pressing, the ear to the body, the seam inspection, was a diagnostic Roy had described in his notes for identifying Mosler floor units from the 1948 to 1953 production window. That era of Mosler manufacturing used a specific body panel gauge that resonated slightly differently when you pressed it, which was not a test Roy had invented, but one he had learned from an older technician in Parkersburg in the late 1970s. The seam quality at the lower back told you something about the plant run. The bezel style told you approximately when the dial was fitted. Put it together, and you could narrow the production window down to about 5 years, and if Roy's notes were right, and his notes were almost always right, you could then know something most people in that barn did not know. Mosler safes from that specific production window were frequently sold to commercial and small banking clients under a package arrangement that included a standard interior configuration, 1 fixed lower shelf, 1 removable upper shelf, a document tray on the left interior wall, and on roughly 60% of units from this period, particularly those sold to insurance offices and small banks. A secondary interior compartment behind a recessed panel on the right interior wall. Not a hidden compartment in the dramatic sense. A design feature. A standard configuration element that most owners didn't use and eventually forgot about. The way you forget about any storage space you don't need until you don't have it anymore. Roy had opened dozens of these over his career. He had found things in those panels. Forgotten bond certificates. Cash that had been sitting undisturbed since before the bank's ownership had changed 3 times over. In one case, in Roane County, a set of bearer bonds from a small savings institution that caused what Roy described in his notebook as a minor legal situation, which resolved favorably, which was all he wrote about it. Mara did not explain any of this to Calvin. Calvin had his mind on the Deere components, which were a good deal, and he knew it. She found him at the north wall of the barn, eating a sandwich he'd pulled from the cooler in the truck, studying a used Deere 6120 header component with the focused attention of someone who had driven 4 hours to look at exactly this thing and was going to look at it properly. She waited until he was done with his first look before she asked. She asked if he would bid up to $90 on a floor safe for her if she gave him a reason to. Calvin chewed. He looked at her. He said he supposed he would if the reason was a good one. She said, the reason was solid. He said, was she going to tell him what it was? She said, not right now. He said, fine, $90. But she was helping load it if he won it. Darren Coots reached Lot 47 at 11:47 that morning. He described it from his podium the same way the catalog did, as is, no combination, vintage floor unit, buyer to arrange removal, and opened bidding at $25. Nobody moved. He dropped to 20. A couple people in the folding chairs looked up briefly, the way you look up when an auctioneer goes quiet for a second, then looked back down. Coots had 31 years. He knew the room. He dropped to 10 and looked sideways across the crowd with the patient expression of a man who has sold things nobody wanted many, many times and will probably sell a few more before the day is done. Calvin raised his paddle. $10. Coots asked for 15. The room didn't answer. He asked for $12.50 in the particular way auctioneers do when they're trying to get a number to exist that doesn't want to exist. Still nothing. He went back to Calvin at 10, asked if he wanted to go $12.50 to keep it moving, and Calvin said no, he'd stay at 10. Coots called it twice and was about to call it a third time when a man in the back, Dale Hicks, said he was standing near the equipment rows, heavyset, wearing a Carhartt that had seen better days, called out 15, the bored way a person calls out a bid when they're mildly curious and the number is low enough to not matter. Calvin looked at Mara. She nodded. He went to 25. The man in the Carhartt went to 30. Calvin to 50. Carhartt to 60. A pause. Then Calvin, watching his sister's face, went to 90. Mara didn't nod this time. She stood still and looked at the safe. The man in the Carhartt looked at the safe too. It sat there rusted and seized and saying nothing helpful to anyone. He shook his head and put his hands in his pockets. Coots said 90 once. He said it twice. He said it a third time and brought down his gavel, and that was the end of Lot 47. One older man near the south wall made a sound. Not quite a laugh. The shape of a laugh. The kind that happens when something confirms what you already knew, and confirming it is pleasant in a quiet way. Calvin signed the paperwork. He borrowed a furniture dolly from a man in the next row over who had one on his truck and owed Calvin a favor from a sale the previous fall. Between the two of them and about 45 minutes of work that Calvin described afterward as genuinely terrible on his lower back, they got the safe into the F-250 bed. Mara held the truck gate and didn't comment on the 45 minutes. They drove to Lewisburg, where Calvin had arranged by phone that morning to meet a locksmith named Warren Foss at a self-storage facility on the west end of town. Warren Foss had been opening safes for 19 years. He looked at the Mosler, looked at Mara, looked at Calvin, and said the locksmith's phrase for when he is being paid to do something he considers inadvisable, which is, "That's your money." He charged $220 because Calvin had negotiated down from the original $275 by explaining the safe was already off-site and didn't need transport, and because Warren said the Mosler mechanism was at least a known quantity, even if it was seized solid. He worked on the dial housing for 40 minutes before he got any movement. Then he worked the locking bolts for another 30. Then there was a sound from inside the door mechanism, a deep, reluctant click, and Warren stepped back and pulled the handle, and the door swung open on hinges that had probably not moved since the first Reagan administration. The interior was exactly as Roy Spence had written it. Fixed lower shelf, slightly rusted, but intact. Removable upper shelf, still in place. Document tray mounted to the left interior wall, empty. And on the right interior wall, a recessed panel. Painted over at some point, the color didn't match the rest of the interior, with a small notch at the lower edge where you could put a finger. Warren was looking at the document tray. Calvin was looking at the shelves. Mara was looking at the panel. She opened it herself. She got her fingernail into the notch and pulled, and the panel came out stiffly on a small piano hinge and revealed a recessed space about 4 inches deep and maybe 12 inches wide. Inside it was a brown envelope, a small cardboard holder, and a letter folded into thirds with no envelope. The brown envelope held 11 shares of stock from the Greenbrier Valley National Bank, issued 1961, with the account holder's name typed on the transfer record in a font that hadn't been common since the era of IBM Selectric typewriters. The bank no longer existed in that form. It had been absorbed through a series of acquisitions over the following decades into a regional holding company. Calvin looked up the current share value on his phone while he was still sitting on the storage unit floor, and the number that came back for 11 shares at the current price was $4,860. The cardboard holder had 11 Liberty Walking half dollars in individual slots, the kind of holder that coin collectors use to keep things separated and identified. Mara had them appraised 3 weeks later at a coin dealer on Quarrier Street in Charleston. The dealer, a man named Phil Drennan, who had been dealing coins since 1987 and was not easily impressed, looked at each one under his loupe and came back with a combined appraisal of $640. He asked where she'd gotten them. She said an auction in Greenbrier County. He asked if she went to many auctions. She said a fair number. The letter was personal. It was addressed to a name that appeared in the estate records, a member of the family whose property had been sold at auction. It was handwritten, dated 1974, and concerned a private matter that had nothing to do with money. Mara read enough of it to understand what it was, then folded it again. She tracked down the estate attorney through Darren Coots and returned it 2 weeks later through the mail, unopened since she'd refolded it, with a note explaining where she'd found it and asking that it be passed to whoever in the family the attorney thought should have it. She didn't include a return address. She never heard back about that part. She didn't expect to. She is 23 now. She finished 2 years at Blue Ridge Community College studying financial technology and transferred to Doubleview. She still has Roy's 7 notebooks, kept in a waterproof box under her bed in her apartment in Morgantown. She has attended, by her own count, somewhere around 44 auctions since that Saturday in April 2019. Not every sale she hears about. She reads the catalogs first, studies the estate profiles when they're available, and makes a short list of lots that might reward 12 minutes of careful attention before bidding opens. She is wrong more than she is right. That is the honest version of this story, and she is the one who insists on telling it that way. She has also found 2 more Moslers at auction since that day. The first was in Pocahontas County the following year, a unit from a farm estate, sold for $65, interior intact, and the recessed panel empty. Nothing behind it but an 1.5 inches of painted steel. The second, at a large estate sale in Monroe County in the spring of 2022, had the same panel configuration and was not empty. She doesn't talk in detail about what was in it. She said it was enough to pay for the next several auctions, and Roy's notebooks are still useful. She said the thing Roy had tried to teach her wasn't that the thing is always there. She said most of the time it isn't there. Most of the time you press your palm against the side of an old safe and it tells you nothing you didn't already suspect, and you write it in the notebook and move on. The lesson wasn't about what you find. It was about looking when everyone else has already decided there's nothing to see. Dale Hicks told this story at a hardware store in Ronchovert sometime in the summer of 2019. He told it to a man named Gerald Oates, who worked the counter there on Fridays. And Gerald told it to his daughter, who eventually wrote it down because it seemed like the kind of story that shouldn't get lost in the ordinary way things get lost. Dale said the part he remembered most was not the door opening, not the stocks or the coins or any of that. He said the part he remembered was Mara Spence crouching in front of that safe before bidding even started, pressing her palm flat against the side panel, just standing quiet, while 200 people walked past and decided it wasn't worth their time. He said he still didn't know exactly what she was doing. He just knew she was doing something that nobody else in that barn was doing, and that turned out to be the only thing that mattered. Roy Spence spent 37 years writing things down in small notebooks so that what he knew wouldn't disappear when he did. Most people who do that, who keep the records, who pass them to someone patient enough to use them, never find out if it worked. He died in February of 2018, 14 months before his granddaughter crouched in front of Lot 47 in Greenbrier County and put her ear to the body of a Mosler floor safe the rest of the room had already written off. He was right, though. Most of what a good safe knows, it will tell you. You just have to know how to ask.